Okay, we are live. So today's topic is the Yellow Vest movement in France, which is something that kind of started in the middle of November a couple months ago, and then kind of picked up steam. And hello, Bethany. Bethany is on the live chat. So yeah, there's political unrest in France. It kind of started with increasing fuel prices. So there were measures that the government of France was putting into place to lessen the subsidies on diesel, especially, and bring them in line with the price of normal gasoline fuel. And the argument for it was to help reduce emissions and disincentivize use of diesel to some degree, that kind of stuff. But people found that they were very much impacted by, or they knew they would be, and if people have a car and they depend on their car and they depend on driving places for their livelihood and for their job, they're going to be upset, and a lot of people were upset. And I think there was some dissatisfaction with the government of France and President Macron, even leading up to that. So this kind of set off some frustration that maybe was already simmering there. So we're going to talk about this, and this is a basic income discussion group. So I don't think very many people, if any, not that I've heard of, in the Yellow Vest movement are talking about basic income. But you can see that little sign there that says, like urgent purchasing power dignity for everyone in French. So that's kind of related to the topic. And then we can ask ourselves, maybe how would this be looking different, or how would the complaints look if they were factoring something like a basic income into what they're. Yeah, go ahead, Madeline.
They do talk a lot about France.
In the Yellow Vest movement in particular?
Well, yes.
Okay.
People who are involved in it, there's a lot of articles about
Oh, cool.
the basic income option.
All right.
Try to solve this.
Well, that's cool. I'm looking forward to hearing more about this and more about that. I'm not an expert on French politics, and I'm not an expert on the Yellow Vest movement, but I think it's something really interesting that's happening right now, and something that we can talk about. So let's start by going around the room and getting people's initial thoughts on what do you think about the Yellow Vest movement, if you have any thoughts about it, and how do you think the topic of basic income can fit into some of these concerns that are coming up? So yeah, you want to start us off, Nick?
Yeah, I really don't know much about it. I mean, I was really interested to learn more than what I knew before, which was just the part about the fuel costs.
Yeah.
And how it's been spun here by some people as, evidence that it's not practical to cut carbon emissions by taxing fossil fuels more. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, I'm sort of like Nick. I haven't really followed this in a lot of detail, although, I think when I first heard about it, it was one of the things that I thought about which was exactly what you mentioned at the introduction, which was that this whole purchasing power problem, and obviously, if it was just about the fuel tax, then that would be one thing, but it's so rapidly switched to this other more broader thing. So that's interesting to me.
Yeah. At first, when I read about it, I thought, the fuel tax. Okay, is that a reason to put yellow vests on and storm the streets and have all this violence? So it's more than that. And I wasn't sure what more there was. And I sent you that article about all the kind of anti-Semitism that's going on in that group, and how it's hewing toward both far right and left. And there's this weird conflation of philosophies and politics in it. That's pretty interesting. I mean, they're all tied together by one thing, which is, this idea of inequality, which we worry about in America too, and the wealthy 1% and all of that. It's like the Occupy movement a little bit here, except that it's It's not just right or left.
Well, the way I understand it is, it's not, the fuel tax is actually a pretty big deal for the people who are protesting, because they're mostly from the rural areas, even though they come to Paris to demonstrate. And for them, the fuel, they have to travel more, to daycare, to their job, to, hospitals. So they found that it was almost like a straw that broke the camel's back. And they are angry because to them it doesn't seem fair. And I think they have a point that the people who can afford the least get to pay the most to try to prevent.
It's very regressive. It's
Yes,
a very
it's
regressive tax.
a very regressive tax for them. And there's so much more about this movement than this. And they're not left or right. They're basically trying to make the system more fair. And of course, there are elements in the whole movement that take advantage of this, like these extremists. But the overall sense to me is that they're trying to. It's interesting. They're trying to really do a lot of what basic income could accomplish here. And in fact, well, maybe I don't want to take up all this time, but I've read quite a bit about this movement right now. I speak French and I read French, so that helps to really look at it from the
That's
side.
great.
So anyway.
Okay. Yeah, I think anything that causes this level of civil unrest is fascinating, especially in a more developed nation like France. I mean, some of the videos and images that doesn't seem to match the picturesque, orderly France that maybe you and I have in our minds. And I don't think the tax is really the root cause. I think it's more a symptom of an underlying problem that goes deeper than that. And I guess the last point is I thought it was interesting how contagious it was. I was in Brussels for 3 months, got back in November, but I read that it spilled over into Belgium as well. So I think it's interesting. It seems to be more of a European trend as well, versus just confined to Paris itself. My intro thoughts.
Like everyone else except Madeline, I don't know a lot about this. I was like, okay, people are mad about rampant inequality in Europe, like seems legit. I mean, your question about basic income, it feels fairly obvious. Like, okay, so if people, if basic income doesn't solve inequality, but if they're like, okay, we can't afford, gas or whatever it is that they can't afford, and if they had enough money to afford that, they would no longer have that problem.
Well, I heard that later this month there's talks about it spilling over into Germany as well. But France has a history of, well, violent revolution, so I guess it's to be expected periodically. Like Thomas Jefferson, I believe it says, periodically this tree of liberty needs to be
Watered with the blood of patriots. So.
And tyrants. So they think of Macron as a tyrant. So even though, as the article said, he was supposed to be a moderate or something like that, and he, well, under Holland or Hollanday or whatever, he implemented a, well, unpopular policy, and then right away after he was elected, he implemented another unpopular policy. So it's kind of expected that he was going to be unpopular. but he was against a really unpopular, well, to the majority of the country, candidate. So Le Pen, the xenophobic candidate. So it's just going. It's the lesser of two evils, which seems to be a popular thing, a common thing in American politics as well.
Okay. Brian, do you want to go ahead?
I mean, I don't know much about this either. It seems if we use the phrase "the straw that broke the camel's back," which is actually in this article also, it implies to me what Robert said about there's something else. There's something like there's a whole bunch of other stuff on the back of the camel, and before this happened. This is, I guess, having more expensive fuel is a day-to-day problem. So, when it happens, it impacts people immediately. But it seems like it's lit a fire of just another word. It's just letting loose all this distaste for the politics in France in general. This president,
Macron.
he didn't turn out the way that people thought he would. It seems. I'm not paying attention to that election, but from an outside perspective, it seemed that he had a better image going into the election than his opponent, and now it turns out that he's kind of the same as she is, or as her image was. Maybe that's a little bit too bold of a statement for someone who doesn't know them very well, but
Who was?
Le Pen?
Oh, Le Pen.
Oh, no.
No,
Not that bad.
Not that bad. Well, I guess I should say he didn't live up to expectations. I think that's fair to say. But yeah, I would say there's definitely a lot more going on than just the fuel tax.
Sultan, do you have any initial thoughts about the yellow vest?
Yeah, I read the article in a July 12, 2017 speech. He said something, I think he finished himself with that statement. It's too wrong, it's unacceptable to me. That's one.
Okay. I can't help but notice that Elizabeth has brought a yellow vest.
It's because I bike.
Yeah. And that's actually interesting because the reason they use the yellow vest, I think it mentions this in the article, is because motorists in France are required to have yellow safety vests in their vehicle in case they break down, so they can put on their vest for visibility. And then this was the fuel tax was something that, or the increasing fuel prices was something that affected motorists.
Right.
Every motorist has one of these, so it's kind of a symbol that identified
interesting.
with the motorists, with the drivers.
That they couldn't afford to fill their car, so they had to get out and put their yellow vests on.
Yeah, they kept running out of gas. Yeah. I don't know if the metaphor goes that far, but maybe. I was in France when Macron was elected, and I remember that it wasn't certain that he was going to win. I mean, he ended up winning by a lot, but there was a lot of uncertainty at that time. So here's the quote from the article. They were angry about the almost 20% increase in the price of diesel since the start of the year, as well as the planned fuel tax hike that President Emmanuel Macron had recently announced. And interestingly enough, that tax hike was canceled kind of in response to this movement. So they kind of achieved their goal in some ways, but it didn't stop there.
Oh, right.
So I think this is, very strong evidence that it's about way more than just the fuel tax hike. I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts on why people are more broadly dissatisfied with Macron.
Well, they have an entire list of demands,
Right.
It's so long, it's just very difficult to get through. Do you want to know about it?
Yeah.
Sure, yeah.
Well, I'm not going to mention it all, but so First of all, they want to instate a 25% top tax rate, which is what we have basically. But right now it's at 49% or 45%. That's what they pay in taxes.
They want to lower it to 25.
Yes, they want to have a maximum tax rate of 25%.
Okay.
They also want to zero out homelessness. They have a whole list of demands that they want
Right.
to actually incorporate in the French constitution, I guess, or laws at least. They wanted to be put into law, and all sorts of other things that have to. It mostly has to do with economics, but there's also. Let's see. They have several sections. Politics, which is one section, the immediate cessation of privatization and the renationalization of public goods like motorways, airports, and railways.
So a lot of these things are currently being managed by private companies.
Well,
Interesting.
it's this trend like everywhere else, privatization of all these public utilities, public goods are being privatized, and we really don't like that because they're at the what you call it, they're at the short end of the stick, because they have to pay more for traveling because they live long distances from work or centers. They also want things like reduce construction of malls and large commercial centers that takes away from smaller businesses in a certain area. So what they want really all makes a lot of sense. But they also want to end France's participation in foreign wars. They want Brexit. Many of them do. They want to exit NATO. So there's a whole mix of extreme demands and very reasonable demands. And most of it would probably not be acceptable to the general population, because it's really not in favor of free markets ideas.
Right.
These demands
It's
come
not quite true. So.
Oh, sorry. Did these demands come up after they were granted the fuel tax reduction?
Yeah.
I mean, okay, so they weren't in place all along. It sounds like they've been coming up.
So I think a lot of people have wanted these things for a while. Different factions have wanted different policy changes. And then I think Bethany makes a really good point. She says that it's often easier to organize a coalition around something discrete, like a new tax.
Yeah.
So then this new tax came into place, and then all these people who had all these different complaints could kind of rally together around that.
And once that got solved, then all the other stuff kind of bubbled up.
Right. You know, once you've opened Pandora's box, you can't just shut it again by canceling a tax.
Right.
Yeah.
And
So I
they
think,
also want minimum wage.
yeah.
And they want it to be at 1,300 euros a month, which is, let's see, how much would that be now? Probably
$1,500–1,600.
Yeah.
$1,600.
It's currently like
$1,600 a month.
$11.
It also depends which part of the country. Certain parts, like Paris, has a higher minimum wage
Okay.
than other cities. But that's part of their demands. Just goes on and on.
I find it hard to believe that every single person that calls themselves a yellow vest agrees with the entire list. I mean, that's the thing that's really challenging for a group that does have reasonable, a huge majority of these people have reasonable demands, and then there's some that have those and some unreasonable.
No, this is an official directive that they have submitted to the.
Who is they? I mean,
they're organizers, they're leaders in that movement.
But those leaders probably themselves have sort of emerged out of the individual movement. So at some point, it's probably it just didn't exist before. So presumably,
Isn't there a strong trend in this movement of being kind of anti-leadership
a
and
little bit Occupy-ish?
Yeah, like I hear
Yeah.
there's kind of a shaming and pushing out of people who are trying to claim leadership positions and that kind of thing. So I'm curious to know more about how this kind of official agenda was put together.
Yeah, I don't know the details about that, but
Yeah.
it's posted online, and everywhere you look, it's the same list, you know, the
Interesting.
same items. So there is something concrete.
So the Occupy movement has come up, and I'm wondering, like, so I mean, just looking at something like the Yellow Vests, it kind of makes sense that, okay, there's kind of a revolution happening. Let's hop on board and everybody, throw in your complaints and all of that. And then you've got, extreme right, extreme left, and maybe people's, what they want kind of contradicts other people in the same movement and that kind of thing. But when you look at the Occupy movement, did that kind of thing really happen? It seemed more like they stayed kind of focused. And I'm wondering what the difference was, how that happened.
Yeah, good question.
I think the financial crisis gave a really, and the strong focus that it was in New York at Wall Street. They kind of tended to keep the agenda from drifting off into every. I mean, even as it was, I felt like when it was going on, the media was constantly saying, "Where's their laundry list of demands?" and
Yeah.
like, you know what I mean,
Yes,
like,
that's
and
right.
you remember back then, 2011 or whatever, and sort of there was a kind of period where it was criticized for not having
Focused.
focused
Yeah.
and not having a list.
Yeah.
But I think in retrospect, it seems, at least now, it seems to be pretty clearly, like it didn't have as many. It wasn't as long as the Yellow Vest movement. It was still tend to be focused on student debt and on like Wall Street regulation and sort of living, that kind of stuff.
And then inequality.
Yeah,
wealth
inequality broadly. The 1%.
Yeah.
That's where the 1% 99
But it was
came
less
from.
focused, yeah.
That ties into the idea of the UBI. They want to reinstate the wealth tax, which was scrapped by Macron, and they are very angry about that. So that is one of their requests, and the other one, which was very important, I wanted to think about it. But so the cap on taxes, because I mean the French do pay a lot of taxes compared to us. Even if you are minimum wage, even though you might not have to pay income tax because you don't make enough, you still have to pay all these other types of taxes. Home tax and fuel tax and sewer tax and all these. So I think taxes in France is a very big deal. And they feel that increasing the fuel tax, just like I said, it really was.
So, what do you guys think would be a way to reduce carbon emissions that's less harmful to ordinary people?
That's harmful in what way? I mean,
Um,
financially or
Yeah, or like
without a tax?
if you're driving to work every day and you're depending on your job, then you're going to be buying a certain amount of fuel and you don't really have a choice. You have to pay whatever the price is. It's not like, oh, fuel gets too expensive, I'll buy less of it now. It's like, that's how much you need to get to your job. So is there a way to reduce carbon emissions without causing such a negative impact on people's lives? Yeah, Richard.
Back in World War II, they had this poster of a person driving alone, and they have Hitler in the in the passenger seat, and they're like, if you're driving alone, you're siding with Hitler or something like that. So maybe they can like carpool more, or they can subsidize buses or something like that.
My sense would be, sorry.
Well, I don't know. It made me think about. If you coupled it with a universal basic income, then people would have more of a cushion, and hopefully, if you could. It seems like you could set the level so that nobody would be totally screwed because they couldn't afford to get to work, but there would still be over a longer term an incentive for people to make to move closer to their job or get a job closer to their home or get an electric car, eventually. But you don't have to do it overnight. I think maybe an interesting question would be to compare that with fuel taxes that ramp up relatively slowly, like over 10 years. So and maybe the UBI is better because people don't really think that far ahead. I mean, I think a lot of people. I don't know. It would be more immediate, right? You would see, well, like today I could save this money instead of thinking, I really want to move closer to my job between now and 5 years from now.
Yeah. So another question we might ask is, could a high enough UBI incentivize people to quit their jobs and then they're no longer driving to their jobs and causing all these emissions anymore? Like, is that
even better?
That's exactly where I was going to be going with that too.
And I think, certainly if you have your basic income, then you are less dependent on your job for your survival or for your day-to-day stuff. So that if going to a particular job or traveling really far for a particular job becomes too costly for you, then maybe you have other options. What's that?
You might actually be able to buy less fuel, like you said.
Yeah.
You have a little bit of room there.
One of the questions I have, and maybe those who know about the ELS like yourself know more about, is what of the people that were forming this movement, what kind of sectors are they in? What is that? Is that concentrated particularly in sort of the kinds of jobs where you do have to commute long distances? Is it what is the nature of those kinds of jobs? Do you have a sense of that? Because I feel like that might. I don't know, just giving an analogy that I know well, which is the Bay Area, Nick knows, is that, the cost of living is so high there that, you have to drive, like if you're a cleaner, say, in Palo Alto, and you live in Stockton, in Central Valley, you have to drive, get up at 5 a.m. and drive, 2 hours. It's absolutely nuts,
I don't think it's just that, they do live more rurally, probably because they can't afford the cities. But it's also, it has to do with the fact that a lot of services have disappeared from these
rural areas
like hospitals and daycares, and so they're forced to. They feel like they have to pay for what's happening with their society, and they don't get to reap the benefits. And they have a point, because people aren't going to build hospitals with 5 people in. So that's why their demands are expanding, because they realize that the way society is becoming and being structured right now is difficult. For them, it's difficult to survive.
So a question we might ask then is, why are they living there? Why are there 5 people living in a place where only 5 people live? And is there something we can do about that? Is there something preventing them from moving to where the infrastructure is being built and put into place?
I'm sorry, I'm probably monopolizing this discussion.
No, it's fine. You're the expert. Yeah.
So you should monopolize.
They want to reverse it. They want the infrastructure to come to them, because it's their country, it's their life, it's where they are. And so why would they have to sacrifice to go to where these companies decide to build roads and hospitals? And so this is in fact one of their demands, to work at the infrastructure and
And these are probably families that have been there for generations.
Right.
It's not even like the U.S. where even though 300 years, some parts of the U.S. have only been settled for 150 years or something, which doesn't seem like a long time, but
Settled by white people.
By white people, yes, thank you. Yeah, exactly. Yes, settled by I meant since the United States. Yeah.
But to get back to maybe finding a solution to paying to reduce emissions, and why not tax the oil companies more, and that way force them to create cleaner ways of,
Energy
creating.
production.
Huh?
Energy production.
Yeah, just clean up that act.
Yeah.
That's one way to.
So
Carbon tax and dividend.
yeah. So one concern I have with that is that no matter which part of the system you're taxing, if you're taxing, at the point of sale, or if you're taxing, the oil companies directly, you're still taxing kind of the overall fuel production process, and that increases prices for consumers, and it kind of does that either way. And if you're taxing at the point of sale, that affects the oil companies too, because the oil companies are now like, okay, now it's harder for us to sell our oil, or our fuel, that kind of thing. So it still creates the same incentives, and I don't know that you're going to have a completely different effect depending on where you tax, as long as you're taxing fuel in general. You know what I mean? Go ahead, Richard. So Bethany says. So I think the problem on the other side of the equation is that it's very inefficient to build state-of-the-art infrastructure within close range of sparsely settled people, in terms of resource use, climate emissions, etc. Even though I'm sympathetic to people not wanting to leave their communities. So I think this is a really good point. Now, Nick brought up the idea of, subsidizing buses and stuff, but does it make sense to have a whole bus go
That was
to...
Richard's idea.
Right. Or sorry, Richard brought up that idea. But does it make sense to have a whole bus that's just going out to a community of 5 people? And are those 5 people even all going to be going to the same place? And there's certain efficiency that you can only really achieve when people are living in more densely populated areas. So it's certainly understandable that there's frustration for people having to leave, their ancestral homes and that kind of stuff in order to survive. But is this one of those situations where really what's best for the people and what's best for our resource usage is to say, hey guys, you got to suck it up and go to somewhere where you can be, benefit efficiently from the infrastructure that we're building.
But is
that
the
kind of stuff.
resentment too because they're paying taxes on things that they don't even get to use?
Well, they do get to use them if they move somewhere.
Right, but only if they
Yeah.
move, right?
Yeah, right.
So I
So,
think you're clearly trying to fight the market. That's the thing. It's
Yeah.
like,
Well, it's sort of. I feel like it's sort of chicken or the egg problem as well,
Yeah.
because like one of the reasons that those places have been depleted is that the jobs migrated away. Industry restructured. Meant that it sort of drained resources away from those, which accelerated that process of like if you had technology as a way to redistribute infrastructure scalably in a way that you could sort of decentralize at least some of the things, maybe not completely. Like we tend to think very much about, yes, there are economies of scale, obviously, in big cities, but we can't have everyone live in Paris, say. That's not going to happen. But yet I feel like I don't know the stats on this, but I get the sense that sort of like you're getting this thing where a lot of cities, like 1 or 2 cities, are emerging as like the major hubs in a lot of different countries. Like the big countries is maybe a lot of cities, but in smaller countries is maybe 1. And that may not be optimal either. You know what I mean? It's sort of like that's like, I don't know this now. I don't know the answer to this question, but
No, it's
Yeah.
true in Holland that they actually have a name. The Rotterdam and Amsterdam is one city now.
Really?
yeah.
Oh yeah, and it's called the border town because it's on the coast. At Rotterdam and Amsterdam are 2 port cities. So, and the rest of it's unbelievable how they've managed to do that. The rest of Holland is tiny, and with many people, and they all cram themselves into this border city. It's huge, and the rest of the country is mostly farmland, and they're okay with that. I can't believe
They
it.
do.
It's just
Boston in Massachusetts or Atlanta in Georgia.
Yeah.
This happens all over the place.
Right.
And I don't know what what self-correcting system will eventually get triggered when a crap ton of people move to when are there going to be too many people in Boston, and then what starts to push that back?
Yeah.
I mean, one thing I thought about in regards to taxation, why not tax people based on their proximity to these resources? Because that would actually that might actually push people away from cities, or some people. If you're on the fence about your taxes, about how much you have to pay for taxes, you might start to move a little bit further away, a little bit closer, and then you just like smear the people out evenly over it's in my computer simulation head, you'd smear the people evenly over the country, because then that would be the way for everybody to get taxed like the exact same amount,
Right. You wouldn't take it to that extreme, but somewhere in between that and
but that's
maybe
a feedback system that would start to push down the cities a little bit and push people out.
I'm sure that the objection to paying taxes for things that you don't use is actually that valid. I mean, we pay property taxes or school taxes in Acton. I pay taxes for the schools. Nobody in my household's going to those schools.
Yeah.
People pay. We just kind of pay as citizens to keep the society going, and it's our choice whether or not we move to these places to access these things or not. I don't know. It doesn't seem. Yeah.
I mean, the way in which we tie educational equality to property taxes is a whole separate way in which the tax system is bullshit and toxic and terrible. But I mean, my impression is that these people are. It's not the oh well, we shouldn't pay for roads because I don't use roads, but it's okay, I pay for taxes so that other people can have roads and hospitals and firefighters, and I as a citizen should be entitled to those same basic things. Why should I have to move to the one city? I am paying taxes for the good of society, but I'm still a member of society and I don't get to access that.
We're crossing some stuff here though, because apparently it's the case in France that a lot of the stuff is privatized. So we have to separate those. Taxes do not fund private roads; they fund public roads.
Right.
I mean, which is why one of their demands is republic. I don't know what the option.
Nationalization.
Nationalize.
Respond to that. You can't lower taxes and increase public infrastructure.
I mean, you can.
I bet you can.
Well, okay.
I mean, you guys have heard me say that I don't really think the link between taxation and what the government is able to provide people is as clear as people kind of think about it most of the time. I don't tend to think of the government as spending taxpayer dollars and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay.
But I thought, Bryant, you brought up an interesting point about taxing people based on how close they are to the infrastructure and the resources. And I think that can actually help us potentially use those resources more efficiently. So the people who are closer to the resources are paying more because they're actually using them for greater benefit, that kind of thing. And this relates to kind of what I was talking about last week with a land value tax. So a land value tax is kind of exactly the thing you're talking about, where you're paying a tax on your land based on what the value of that land would be if it were just an empty lot. And that's going to be higher if you're in the middle of the city, closer to transportation and other infrastructure and hospitals and that kind of stuff. So it's a very I think what you described is exactly that. That's the same tax. Yeah, and I think that can help us use resources more efficiently. But the whole narrative that you're paying taxes and that's paying for stuff that you're not getting, I don't even know how valid that is as a narrative. And certainly it can be something you're upset about if that's how you believe money works or that's how you like to frame things. But is it really? I don't know.
Because it's your choice in many ways to be in a place where you're not able to access the best hospitals. I mean, people want to move to the country, like Dean and Gail. They don't even have internet. there. They can't sell their house in the land there,
Right.
but they love the country. They'd rather stay there.
So I want to hear from Elizabeth.
Okay, I know
I
she's.
I don't know your friends Dean and Gail, but when people choose to move to the country and live without internet, that's usually a very privileged choice that they're making. And my impression is that these are people who have always lived in the country, who feel like progress is passing them by. That like everyone used to have kind of mediocre roads, and now like our roads are in disrepair. And in Paris, they have like quality roads. And if I want to have good roads, I need to move to Paris. I can't afford to move to Paris. So, like, it's not that they're, I mean, I'm sure that many of them are like, well, I grew up in this house, I don't want to leave, I don't want to move to Paris, like, I hate the city, but I suspect that many of them do not feel like they have a choice.
So here's a question, Elizabeth. So you're saying people who choose to move into the country, and do without certain infrastructure, they can afford to do that. They have this privilege, et cetera, et cetera.
Many people, like not everyone. But.
Right. And I think that's true. But then a question we might ask is, for the people who already live there, is it any different than they just have this privilege and they got used to this privilege and now they're really upset that maybe they're not going to have that privilege anymore of being able to live in the country and survive there?
But they've been surviving there. How have they been surviving there?
Well,
Well, I mean, no one's talking about evicting people from Paris,
taxes.
right? No one's talking about people like, everyone should move out of Paris because, I kind of like Elizabeth. I'm thinking that, it's like it's sort of, I don't think there's for these people, it's probably not a lot of choice. It's not like you can relocate all of a sudden. You don't have the resources. It's not going to be easy to do that. So, I understand that there's probably society has to make a cost benefit analysis, but I don't think I think one of my sense from the impetus behind the Yellow Vest movement is that those people just don't think they have they're sort of being told basically this is what you're going to have to do.
Right.
They don't get to choose.
Right.
Yeah, and I guess it's sort of like thinking about Alex's question about privilege. I feel like many people are like, oh, I'm going to live out in the country, or people who are like, I have money where like I can just I can buy my groceries, but I don't have to work. Like I'm getting dividends on my stocks, or I retire, or whatever, and so they get to just sort of enjoy all the what they consider being the nice things about the country. Whereas these people have been living and working there, and they're like, okay, I used to be able to work and make ends meet, and I also like this area, and so I feel like calling it a privilege, to be like, oh yes, they get to enjoy being in the country, and they don't have that privilege anymore, feels a little bit like a inaccurate comparison. Like, oh, the people who want to move out get this privilege. People who have been living there, well, they also have this privilege. That the privilege to sort of enjoy the country is experienced in different ways. When you're like, I've retired there, versus like, well, I grew up here and I used to be able to feed my family.
Right. I just want to clarify that the people I mentioned have been living in this place for probably 40 years. And so when the internet came in, they would like to be able to access it, but they can't because the cable didn't get installed. The roads are bad. They always wanted to be in the country, but they're not rich. I mean, they've worked all their lives. It's not like that. But it's also true that they don't want to live in the city. I mean, there is a trade-off, and they've made that decision. It's not like they're rich, but it's also, and they work. It's also true, though, that they don't like city life. So do they pay the same amount of taxes as people who live in the city? Should they? I guess that's the question, but then who's going to scale that?
Yeah, who's
going
to
to scale that? I don't.
Once you get to line drawing, you have to turn around and go back.
Right.
I think.
And some people might decide, hey, I liked it before 20 years ago, but now I want to be, nearer hospitals, so put one out here where I am.
I mean, the thing I'm thinking is, I think we're being a little too black and white about living in the country and living in Paris. Like, why not just move halfway to Paris or something? I don't know. I mean, maybe that's a little on the nose, I think people say, but
I'm kind of.
There's got to be some middle ground where there is some infrastructure, some schools, some better roads.
Yeah, and I don't want to be cynical, but to your point earlier, as the free market evolves and these resources are consolidating, i.e. around Paris, these people in the country isn't kind of a adapt, like sink or swim. You have to make a choice.
Or you can rise up and abolish capitalism. That's your
There's always that.
It's of course it's a choice.
So,
I mean, you can
I-
protest or you can
Yeah.
The quick answer to that is that they just can't afford to like go. There are certain places where certain people just can't afford to up and move to.
No.
But that's why I'm saying like just go part of the way there or something. I don't know.
So-
Some adaptive response.
I think a deeper issue here might be that, if there are big changes going on in your economy and in your society, then those changes are going to affect different people differently. And if you've got a change that's, really good for most people, but then it's, causing difficulty for other people, is that, a reason to fight against that change? And I think obviously you want to figure out a way to minimize the harm to anyone who's being harmed, but that can be a hard thing to do. And this kind of segues into the next post or the next quote, which is protesters claim that the decision was yet another sign that the
What
arrogance
decision? I'm sorry. Where?
the
I see.
decision
Oh, yeah, the
to
tax, yeah.
do the fuel tax. That the decision was another sign that the arrogant and privileged president is out of touch with regular folks struggling to make ends meet. So my question is, was there anything any president could have done that didn't really anger a lot of people? Can you guys imagine, like, well, I mean, like, people are angry about Macron. Like, what do we think the right president would have done, or the president who is doing the best for the people? Yeah, go ahead, Madeline.
He should have gotten rid of the wealth tax. I mean, we don't have one, so we don't mind not having one. But
Right.
the French did, and so that's a big deal because they feel that he's he's for the rich.
Yeah.
And they had a point. The wealth tax is a big deal for them. And he made some comments throughout this whole process and throughout his presidency, which was very derogatory of the common man.
Right.
I think he has created an image of the president for the rich. I don't think they had invented that, and maybe he could have done other things, like not raise the fuel tax right away like this in a fell swoop. It reeks a little bit of disregard for the French people.
So maybe he could have made a big difference by being more respectful to the people.
Not just more, with his policies, not with his words.
But also with his words too,
Yes.
right? Yeah. Richard.
I lived in Wisconsin for a decade, and there's around the city, which had like 9,000 people. They had all these little towns and things, and they didn't there was a policy in Wisconsin, they didn't tax the fuels at all, and they dyed them a particular like red or something like that, and so that you couldn't like distribute it to people who weren't farmers, and so I don't know if that's a good reason, a good solution, but that's what he could do. That subsidize fuels by not having them pay taxes on it in the areas where they have difficulty traveling about.
It makes me think that sort of the kind of the arrogant privilege sort of thing makes me think that this is, I mean, maybe you said some intemperate statements about people, but my guess is that this probably came about more out of ignorance. I mean, if you're a sort of politician surrounding yourself in this kind of world where all your advisors live in the same places as everybody else and they all vacation together, and they sort of going to have a view of the world that when they put together policy, they probably didn't even think about this as like having this effect, which meant that they weren't really taking into account, they weren't listening to those voices because those voices weren't at the table.
That shouldn't have been in politics.
It makes you a
That's
terrible
not a
policy
policy very
maker.
politics.
What's that?
It makes you a terrible policy
Yeah.
maker if you're not thinking about like
And I think, like-
People not like you.
Yeah, basically, I think and I have a feeling that more than anything, they probably were completely taken off guard by this. They probably had no idea because they don't have to pay. They're probably not driving diesel cars hundreds of miles every week or whatever. So I think that's like a failure at that level.
Yeah, Richard.
How much is diesel in France? I know. Last time I heard in Germany, it's like $9 per liter. So how much is it in France, and how much would 20% of an increase be?
Yeah, fuel is extremely expensive everywhere in Europe. But it's because they rely on funding many types of programs with their fuel tax, not just, that's how they structure it. So
Can you look the cost of diesel?
It's 139 a liter in France.
Euros?
1.39 euros. Yeah,
a liter,
per liter.
that's 2.5.
Yeah,
1 gallon is 2.5.
1 gallon. Yeah, it's
Yeah, 1 gallon.
but no, it's 3.5.
It's like three.
3.5 liters. Yeah. So times 3.5 times 1.2. So it's like $6 a gallon. Yeah.
Which is way more than it is here.
Yeah.
I think diesel. This is kind of off the top of my head. Diesel was cheaper than gas the last time I saw a sign.
Yeah, it's
Which was-
cheaper, but
Yeah.
people are quitting using diesel cars nowadays, especially
really?
in Germany. Yeah.
Okay. No, I actually just meant here. The last time I saw a sign in the United States, diesel was cheaper, and I always had this impression that it's like
I think it's
always
always
30%
cheaper.
more.
But diesel, you also get more miles per gallon, right? But it's also
But
dirtier.
Also, you need
Yeah.
a catalytic converter because it's a filthy fuel.
You have to have a
Right.
specific kind of car, obviously.
Yeah, you need
I don't
a
know.
diesel
Despite
engine.
Volkswagen's
I mean,
lies about
$6 is like twice as much as it is here.
Yeah.
Bethany has some.
Yeah, so Bethany was. This is to our point before about, we were saying, well, what if we just overthrow capitalism? Someone may have said that.
I said someone said, "Well, your only option," and I pointed out that there's
Yeah.
an addition. There's a separate option.
So Bethany says, I think the efficiency returns to denser population are deeper than any particular economic system, and I think that's right, and any political system. So the idea is that there's ways to be less wasteful of resources or to be more efficient in our use of resources. And that involves, having people being reasonably densely packed so they can access the infrastructure.
Yeah.
If you tried to build, subways going to every small town
Right.
in the world, that would be very wasteful. And
Wouldn't
you
be
can't,
maintained.
well, if
It's
you,
so expensive to maintain like a bigger and bigger and bigger network.
sure.
Yeah.
I mean, if you happen to figure out a way to build them and maintain them,
Yeah,
you would
yeah.
be wasting a lot of resources, including people's time and labor and a lot of other stuff too. So you can't really kind of get around this by changing your economic or political system. Like these are like physical constraints. So I think that's what Bethany's pointing out.
I think that's probably true, but it's also true that we can choose to create infrastructure in place and build it out, and then have people.
It's like the genesis.
You
of
can
things.
create, yeah. So I mean, they've
Yeah.
done that in the past. Created like Canberra, capital of Australia, and maybe none of people like it very much, but it's
Brasilia.
Brasilia. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean they've done this and it worked. They can, they could do, build like more regional. Like they could, be a wealth transfer or a resource transfer from. Like, in other words, you don't just have to say, like, okay, well, the existing arrangements are good enough, and what's going to happen is that the existing hubs are just going to get more and more wealthy, and it's going to drain more and more resources out of those other places. You could reverse that without losing the benefits of the denser population. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Sorry?
Go ahead, Richard.
In China, there are 50 million apartments that are completely vacant, and all these cities, there's no one in them. It's just utterly bizarre.
And
So-
there's a market there because maybe I and some of my friends plan an awesome city and we get some VC to fund. Seriously, I mean that is a massive thing that nobody does. I guess I don't know. You can just build a city out of nothing, and maybe you would like attract people and build
Well,
a whole new thing.
Even
I don't
even
know.
if you do, I don't think it solves the fundamental problem, because you've created another city, but now you're still living in a world with a bunch of cities. So it's not. I mean, like,
I think the small businesses. If enough people did that, you just have a bunch of tiny cities. I don't know. I'm thinking of my.
Yeah, but Alex,
So-
I think Alex's point is that, like, that you still end up with this density, right? Because that's sort of what's optimal, that you end up with a bunch of
right,
Yeah.
right. You're not. I mean, like, it's not the answer to not building infrastructure only in cities. It's just maybe you feel that the number of cities is not high enough to be optimal or something like that. So
Yeah,
you
that's
create
what I'm-
more. And maybe that's the issue. But I don't know that it is. I don't know what the right number of cities for
It's
humanity
a
is.
really a hard, yeah.
Yeah.
It's probably an unanswerable question.
And that's what I was
Right.
trying to get at with this. Like, what are the forces that govern, groups of people to move into and out of cities? Like, what is the thing that's gonna, when are we gonna know that there's too many people in this one city and they're gonna start moving away? Like, what is naturally going to happen? It's just a bunch of people in, in town. I feel like it's got to be something that like counteracts.
I mean,
I don't know.
my intuition is that if a city gets too crowded, then people will start leaving and moving to other cities, and
yeah.
and the new big city is not going to be necessarily something that someone has to plan in the middle of nowhere and construct from nothing. It's like a smaller town evolves into a bigger city
Yeah,
as
exactly.
people move into it, that kind of thing.
And
So,
when does that start happening? Like, what are the forces at play there? The market.
well, I think it's always happening. Like, you see real estate prices get too expensive in New York, and the population of New York starts going down a little bit as people move to other places, and there's always people
It's
moving.
always like
Cities are growing and shrinking and
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. Yeah, I don't know that it's something we need to like analyze and really like calculate what the appropriate number of cities is, so much as it is we can allow it to organically.
Yeah,
sort
I think
itself out.
that one of the issues is, I mean, the organic is good up to a point, but also organic sort of implies like that you're going to have a first mover advantage of like big cities. Capital is going to drive a lot of this stuff, so it's not necessarily, may not be even optimal for an environmental point of view, like to have really crowded cities, but it might be good for finance, because they can have a lot of access to a lot of cheap labor. We see this in Boston. This constant churn to get people in, but yet the prices of real estate and rent is very high. So I think my sense is that sort of letting the market decide on its own isn't going to even necessarily get you to an optimal environmental footprint, nor even necessarily a good day-to-day living arrangement. I don't know.
Yeah, because there are questions that sort of like, what do you optimize?
Exactly. It comes
on?
back to that. Yeah. What are you optimize? What are we optimizing here? Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so Bethany says crowded cities are great for the environment, so far as I understand. I guess not good for pandemic disease outbreaks, but that's a side point. So I kind of agree with this point, and my question is, what do you mean, Alex, when you say that people living in big cities could not be the best thing for the environment?
I'm not saying that people living in the cities are efficient for sure, but I mean just the particular arrangement of the cities as they are now isn't necessarily optimal, because you could imagine that there may be like a lot of distance to get your if you have one city in a very sparsely populated area, getting your stuff from the farms out here, that might be very environmentally intensive versus like having maybe a bunch of smaller cities. So in other words, I'm saying like, yes, density is true, but like how they're arranged is probably, I mean, I'm not an expert in this area, but it seems to me that I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a difference between saying cities are environment. The density is good for the environment. I agree with that, but just going from that to say, oh well, therefore
Everyone should live in New York City.
everyone should all live in big cities. You know what I mean? That's kind of where I'm coming from.
Okay.
Richard.
Yeah. I've settled.
I believe it's in Newark, New Jersey. They're building like hydroponic skyscrapers so they can grow their food there. So that could be a solution to not having to transport things from the countryside into the city. You could just build the food, create things to grow your food right in the middle of the city, and then distribute it out from there.
Yeah, I'd like to see a lot of like sort of going back to this was in the 70s, the sort of small is beautiful thing, like the idea that you could have local, you could use the high tech stuff to create more like sustainable local economies, and that might include big cities, smaller, and yes, there's still obviously cities have a big advantage, but I can't think that having everyone clustered into mega cities, is going to be.
What if it's one huge megacity on Mars?
That would work.
It'd be great for the environment on Earth.
Yeah. We should all just move to Mars. Yeah.
Elizabeth.
I sort of relate to Richard's point about hydroponic skyscrapers. I definitely take Bethany's point about cities, but also I think cities don't always end up with the infrastructure that they necessarily need. So like, yeah, okay, great having everyone live close together so that they're not commuting as far to work. So if I'm living in Somerville commuting to Boston, that's better than if I'm living in like Fitchburg and commuting to Boston using like less fuel. But if I live in LA and I'm sitting on the freeway for 2 hours, like that's not like, oh great, I live in LA, I live in a big city. Like, well, LA is a giant, giant city, and I mean, if you sort of define like the metro area, and that's not necessarily environmentally friendly. Like, if you had like a light rail line or a subway or something where you can have like back to the like driving your car by yourself, deciding with Hitler from wartime. Like, if we have the infrastructure to enable more of that, and yeah, it's not cost effective to do that. Maybe like in the city of Fitchburg because not enough people live there for it to be worth it. But we don't necessarily do a good job even in giant cities like Los Angeles. So this idea that like, oh, everyone's densely populated, we're gonna then organically like get all the efficiencies of that assumes that a lot of stuff is natural in a way that it's not.
So I think that's a really good point, that there's often room for improvement of infrastructure and resource management even within a city. And part of the problem with Los Angeles, of course, is that it's not nearly as dense as a city like New York, that kind of thing. I'm going to go to Madeline first.
Actually, I have
This
something
is
about
not about the environment.
All right, let's go to Richard first.
Actually, in the middle of last month, the 19th, I believe, Elon Musk debuted his his boring company, his hyperlink or whatever
I
it
heard
is,
about this in
in
Chicago.
Los Angeles, and they have this like rails underneath the city, and they transport the car on this like trolley type thing, and then they raise it up to into this like hole in the road, and then the car drives off, and so that could be a way around. Well,
Traffic.
traffic.
The traffic's bad, but Elon's building some tunnels.
Yeah. Go ahead, Madeline. Yeah.
I just wanted to get back to France.
Yeah.
You know that France has the second highest welfare benefits of the world in the world. Estonia.
Oh, well.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
So
Maybe
I
my
was
plane
wondering if a Frenchman gets it's about double what people get here now, and it's also for much longer. So how does that would that affect the implementation of the UBI, because they are already taken care of much better than we are.
Everyone, though? Or is social, when you say social welfare, is
Well,
that like,
there's actually, it's more complicated than that. In France, they have a benefit called RSA, which is equivalent to negative, what you call it, a negative
Income tax?
income tax, yes. And that's, everybody can get that. But it's not a lot. It's not as much as the welfare that, the overall welfare that people get. It's just part of it.
So these welfare programs are like conditional benefits if you're out of a job or that kind of
Right,
thing.
you have
Yeah.
a child, benefits if you have
I see.
children, you have benefits if you're unemployed, you have benefits if you are disabled, and all these. It's incredibly complicated system. Actually, most people don't even know that they're entitled to many of these programs, especially this RSA. And I read one article that was talking about UBI in France that might go towards solving these problems with the yellow vests, is to actually create, they don't call it a universal basic income, they call it a basic income that everybody would get. Except that when you find a job, it would be reduced with a certain amount. And with the money you get from a job, it would equal to a certain amount. You know what I'm saying?
So is that through the taxes? Like you pay higher taxes, and then it ends up canceling out the basic income?
It's more like a guaranteed minimum.
Yes.
Okay.
No, it's not. I don't understand.
So yeah, so with basic income, you could give everyone the same amount, and then if people have a certain level of income in the economy, you could tax them higher, and then it ends up taking away what you gave them through the basic income and cancels out that way. So anything you do if you want to reduce the amount of basic income, you could do the same thing just by increasing the taxes. It's just a matter of where you do it. And the math ends up being the same, but people might feel differently about it in terms of the...
You would tax the
second
basic
one.
income?
No, you tax the person if they, you tax income, whatever their wages are, or that kind of stuff.
But it's the same here, isn't it? If you find a job and you're on welfare, then the welfare part gets
Right. So the idea with basic income would be just everybody gets this payment,
Right. Yes.
and then you figure out how to take it away on the taxing side if you want to do that. Instead of giving less of a basic income, it's just you handle in a different part of the law, the regulation.
So this idea of basic income, UBI,
Yeah.
would only be, you would only qualify if you're
Okay.
poor or part of the job.
So that's what I was asking. Okay,
So
that
it's
makes
not
sense.
universal.
Okay, go ahead, Richard.
I actually heard about the RSI, where the people who get it, they move to a less expensive country so that it stretches for I heard a lot of people go to Hungary or the Czech Republic, and so they live there until it lapses, and then they have to move back.
You can still get it when you're living abroad for a period of time.
I believe so. I think they can get it for 8 years or a decade or something.
And
Well,
it's
you would move to Hungary, obviously, because it's part of the EU.
it's
So it doesn't matter when you.
it's interesting that a lot of people don't know that they're entitled to these programs.
Right.
And I'm wondering if that's intentional, and that's part of the reason why they can afford these programs is because most people don't know to ask for the benefits.
Yes.
If you suddenly started a campaign where you're entitled to all this stuff and you're getting the word out, and then everybody starts asking for these benefits, is it going to be something that they're going to be able to afford anymore? So that's an interesting
But
question.
I'm sorry, but I'm going to
Yeah.
add that you are actually partly paying for it because it's based on the taxes that you pay as an employee. So
Right.
if you don't benefit from it, then it's the program itself that creates a benefit.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly moral arguments to be made as you pay into it, so you deserve to get it out, that kind of thing. But that's not going to necessarily answer the question of whether they can actually afford to give you the money. Yeah. So Michael Price on the live chat says, I believe the big city model has a negative impact environmentally. More waste, traffic, overuse of local natural resources, and overuse of its nature areas. And I think he brings up a good point, especially with traffic. Traffic is a byproduct of everyone being so kind of densely packed. And if you're just trying to get from point A to point B and there's no traffic, that's going to be a lot less emission than if everybody's trying to find a parking space and kind of gridlocked and that kind of thing. So I think there are certainly downsides to to the city model.
Walkable big cities.
Yeah,
That's the key.
walkable public transportation. And I think this speaks to Elizabeth's point of there's ways to do infrastructure in cities that's less wasteful. I feel like overall the big city is more efficient. We talked about food being produced, kind of remotely and being brought in, and kind of the cost of transportation, including the emissions involved and that kind of stuff. But I think that's very, very tiny compared to the efficiency of, well, you're kind of producing it and bringing it all to one place, and that's the transportation costs or the impact of that transportation is basically negligible compared to the benefit you get of just kind of producing the food efficiently and bringing it all to one place. When you talked about sustainable kind of local communities growing their own food and stuff, I think in each community you can kind of be as efficient and sustainable as possible, but overall the existence of these communities is probably bad for the environment, or worse for the environment than if you're producing all your food like really efficiently using efficient processes and then transporting it once all to one location. That's going to be much less impactful.
No, I think that's an empirical question. You'd have to I think that I don't know if there's an easy way to say that's going to be true for every possible model. I mean, I think there's like a lot of different ways to do that, right? There's you're right in that like some cities are going to be I don't know. I don't want to necessarily make this my hill of die on here, but but I don't know. My intuition is, not being an expert or anything, is that cities have and I agree with everything you said about dense cities and there are efficiency gains, but that doesn't necessarily mean that sort of you can't experiment with other different kinds of models of how community might evolve. Because if the technology develops to the point where we can build smaller communities, there maybe even be cities. There just be smaller cities. They don't have to be like Boston City. Maybe they'd be regional centers.
Size and density often go together, but they're not the same thing.
Right.
And I think it's density that gives the efficiency.
The density. Right. Yes, exactly. And so you could have a small but dense kind of community.
Yeah, and I think
where
Arcosanti.
I think most of the gains you get are in the first 100,000 people in your population. It's once if everybody's in 100,000 population cities and those cities are individually very dense, then combining two of those cities into one 200,000 people city is not going to get you that much. There's diminishing returns on this stuff, but certainly if you've got communities where there's 5 people living there, that kind of thing.
I mean,
Aside from the
If they all live
cities
in
and
100
the
square feet.
rebuilding of the infrastructure, I mean, there are the list of demands. There's homelessness and end to homelessness. There's a lot of things on there that basic income has some play with, and even fuel tax. I mean, if you have a basic income, you can still afford the fuel better than you could before you had the basic income. Or as somebody said, you might not
Only
even
that
go to
had
a
been
job.
their demand.
You might not even have a job. You might not need to go to a job.
Right.
So I wondered what some of the other things were on that list. Homelessness, I remember, but there was a conflict of things.
Slew of things. Let's see if I can find it.
Yeah, thanks.
Depends.
Thanks for bringing back to the movie,
Yeah,
because I feel like we're going off
interested
on
in
this.
the-
At least
in
I
the
was. in this
architectural
architecture,
stuff,
and
yeah.
that's
Yeah,
that's another whole.
I don't know how to plan a city.
By the way, I just looked up 90% of the French population lives in Paris.
90?
Wow.
19.
Oh,
19.
Oh, okay.
Oh, okay.
But 50% of the Dutch population lives in this past the border.
The boundary area.
So that's 50%.
Wow.
So it's an interesting. Anyway,
Yeah.
sorry.
Oh, and then there was that article I sent you, Alex,
Yeah.
about all the other the resentments that
This
are,
article.
Yeah, I mean, that's an odd combination of wanting equality and a better life for people who need it, and then this other thing that's going on with the reemergence a resurgence, or maybe it never went away, of this strong anti-Semitic movement with the Yellow Vest. You know, I just don't know how that fits in.
Yeah.
I hate
Do
to
you?
be politically incorrect, but there's a huge Muslim population in Paris. And that's one of the reasons anti-Semitism has grown. So
Yeah.
Like that it's coming from the Muslim population? Interesting.
It's their culture.
Yeah.
Interesting. I'm
Well-
dubious, but I don't have any empirics on
Oh,
that.
but is that
I-
part of the Yellow Vest movement too?
Yeah, I mean, like this. I think this article is maybe a little bit extreme in saying that like the heart of the movement is anti-Semitic. But you know, I think there's, you know, when people are frustrated or they're struggling, and they're, you know, competing for resources and everything, that creates an incentive to create an us and them type
Yeah,
situation,
yeah,
and to
Right.
find people to blame and to fight against, you know, whatever the perceived enemy is.
Right.
And that can be rich people, it can be
Yeah.
Jews,
Populist
and
movements,
often,
yeah.
you know, those
Yeah.
two things are combined.
Right, and there's like
Yeah.
thousands of years of tradition of having it be the Jews.
That's
Right,
absolutely
it's
true.
traditional. Yeah.
Traditional.
It's I think, you know, something, you know, if you have a basic income, and people feel secure and they feel like their livelihoods are, you know, are being properly taken care of, and you know, they don't necessarily have to go on the defensive or go on the attack. You know, there doesn't have to be an enemy if you're not feeling like you're being made to suffer,
Right.
that kind of thing.
And
So
that's been your argument too
Yeah.
for poverty in general, that people in poverty who, well, the riots in Detroit, I mean, I'm talking about the 60s now,
Yeah.
70s, but there were a lot of riots in African American communities that really were poverty based. A lot of it was anger about racism, but also about the way of life that they had in the inner city. So that makes sense too, that there's that rage
yeah.
when you feel like you're not getting what you deserve. So
Yeah.
you find,
And there's, you know,
and sometimes there is a target.
there's often compelling narratives that you can come up with, for who to blame, and that can be, you know, useful to kind of bring people together and have
Yeah.
something to fight against. But it can be dangerous and it can be damaging, and it doesn't necessarily lead to the kinds of solutions that will help their lives improve.
Yeah,
It's tough.
right.
It's tough.
No, I know.
Any kind
And-
of
Yeah.
any kind of movement that you think of, most of the people in the movement are not thinking deeply about the causes of things and how to fix problems and stuff like that. They're mostly following the crowd, and they know what they're frustrated about in their lives, and they're hoping, for answers. And,
Yeah.
and
And
yeah.
they're with other people who feel the same way, and that creates a kind of
yeah,
community of resentment.
yeah.
Actually, I was surprised
Go ahead, man.
at how well informed this movement seems to be because of this manifesto. You know?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
very detailed and clearly know what's what.
Do you have a
So
sense of
the
who?
person who wrote it.
Yeah,
I mean,
who
that's
wrote
the
that?
thing. The person
Yeah.
who wrote
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
well read,
Yeah.
but the hundreds of thousands of people, I don't know,
Well, he
that are
can't.
following
He
them.
can't just publish this without the consent.
Yeah, you've got to have some sort of
Yeah,
consensus.
some-
Otherwise, you're going to have people on Twitter being like, Joe down the block wrote this stupid manifesto. Like,
Yeah.
I think Frexit is a terrible idea. And if you have like 900 people on Twitter being like, Frexit is dumb, then
So
they're going to take it off the
I think
manifesto.
it's a good sign when your movement has someone writing intelligently, in support of it. If there are people thinking deeply and other people are following that, that can be a good thing. If the person who's thinking deeply is actually thinking deeply in a way that's constructive and going to, you know, potentially push things in a direction that benefits people. I don't know if particularly this manifesto fully qualifies. You know, like I don't know if Frexit is a good idea. I don't know if, you know, like some of these other things are good ideas.
Well, no, I don't think
yeah.
they're good ideas, but people have thought about
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
What I meant to say what I meant to say is that just because this person or whoever wrote this thing seems to be thinking intelligently doesn't imply that every single member of the group is doing the same thing or even agrees. That's what I really meant
Yeah,
to say.
which is
It's
true
kind
of
of
any group. Like most people who
Yeah,
are
yeah.
voting are
And
not
the
like,
bigger
I
the
have thought
group
deeply about
gets,
this.
too. Yeah.
So,
I was
go
going
ahead.
to say, like, just sort of tying it back to the basic income idea. I mean, it seems, I think we've talked about this before, but sort of, if you provide that security, then you can, like you said, you can lessen the us versus them mentality, and also I think that for the immediate, I think like the fact that this went on like a light switch, and if you had basic income in place, you could absorb the increased cost, and that I think the degree, and I think it's true here, the degree to which like I was reading like the other day, like 75% of Americans live like paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah.
Which is huge reason for all these resentments, and this is true in other developed countries too. So it's not just France. So I feel like that even that cushion could really, if you were to introduce it quickly, could really make a big difference.
Yeah.
Towards like at least I mean, it may not be it's something, I don't think UBI is like the solution for every political problem, but that alone, I don't know if there's anyone doing any real research on that, but that to me is
In terms of bringing down the tensions and the us versus them,
reducing the
tribalism
feeling of the
and-
day-to-day volatility of like of increased prices going crazy, not being able to sort of like that, just that alone.
Even Macron suggested some form of UBI.
Really?
Yeah. It's brewing, from every corner.
Do you know what he suggested in particular?
No, I forgot, but I remember reading that he was also
Interesting.
not now, but maybe a year ago.
Oh, okay, so not in
Yeah.
response to this, but
No.
earlier on. Okay.
So, toying with the idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
In Italy, they actually are going to implement a basic income, but it's misnamed or whatever. It's just for the poor, so it's more like a. Well,
It's more like a minimum income
minimum.
or an income guarantee.
Mhm.
Okay. Yeah, I think I heard about that. If you guys haven't been following Italy, they had an election last year and elected a coalition government of like extreme right and extreme left, and they wanted to do something similar to an income guarantee. Like that was one of the things they agreed on. Yeah.
It's like $700 or $800 per month.
What is the difference between economically? What is the difference between an income guarantee and a basic income?
So an income guarantee is conditional. It goes to people who don't have enough income.
Yeah. The idea is that you get everybody up to some minimum level.
Yeah.
But then what happens after that? Because people that already have enough money getting a basic income are going to feel it. So what's the difference?
So it depends on how you implement it. I think the wrong way to do an income guarantee, or maybe the worst way to do it, would be to just top everyone off to a minimum level, because then there's no incentive to do any work for any wage less than, whatever is that minimum.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I think the way they usually try to do it is have some benefit that starts at a certain minimum and then the benefit tapers off as you go up. So instead of physically topping off to exactly one level, you preserve some of the market incentives for labor and all of that. And then once you're doing that, it can look identical to a basic income plus an income tax. which is the same thing as a negative income tax. So if you give everyone the same amount of money and then on top of that you overlay a tax, then that looks exactly the same as if you're giving more money to the people who have less, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
So do you see that probably happening even if we call it UBI? Do you see that sort of thing actually falling out at the end? Or
Do I see that falling out?
do you see that being the outcome? That it actually looks more like this, this thing where people's basic income just gets taxed out of their income later.
Most basic income proponents propose doing it that way. Yeah. And they would still argue that the benefit of basic income, a lot of the benefits of basic income is still there in terms of it going to everyone because the taxation is like a separate process.
Yeah.
So you're not thinking of it as something that only some people get, even though the richer people are paying a higher tax.
Yeah, that's the thing that's
Yeah.
It's the
interesting.
psychological effect of giving it to everybody and not taking it away, and then also giving to even rich people because then everybody's invested in the system, right? I mean, that's
Right.
what at least one of the arguments that I've heard. Like the strongest arguments in terms of making it survive politically is that you say this is something everyone gets, because then you don't have to have the problem of the
This is
us
better
versus
for
them. Everybody is getting it,
Right.
exactly how you did it
Right.
later on in
Right.
terms of like.
And it's also, it can be logistically smoother to do it that way too. If you're paying your income tax once a year, but you're getting your basic income in a weekly check or something like that, that can be more convenient for people. And
Well, it
more
also
streamlined.
reduces the
Yeah.
problems that the yellow vest movement, this volatility in the economy, because
Right.
like if the market is doing this or like basic services are going up, you've got this thing coming in that's not dependent on labor. That's a huge,
It's like Social
And-
Security.
yeah.
It's
Yeah.
just like that. It's great.
Well, yeah, and I mean, and also another factor has to do with the incentives of the government. So with the basic income, you're taking away the incentive for the government to decide that someone doesn't deserve anything. And instead, it's on the taxation side, where it's now up to the government to figure out who should have taxes levied on them. So then that ensures that if there's any inefficiency in the system, it's not going to be that people didn't get their basic income. It's going to be that you forgot to tax someone.
Yeah.
So that's kind of better for people too, and it aligns the incentives of the government to do the work that needs to be done for the system to work efficiently if they want to get their tax revenues. So that's part of it too.
Okay. I get it.
Yeah.
So this guy, his name is Abdul Bidar. He's I think he's an economist. He calls it the realistic utopia. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Robert.
Just a general question: has there been any example in the past where you said, "Okay, everyone gets the basic income, but then we'll just tax it right back as this psychological mind trick in a way"? I mean, it seems kind of dumb, but I guess if we're talking strictly just a psychological advantage, is that just a theory, or is that something like that occurred in the past?
Well, I don't think basic income has really happened ever.
Like in any sort of other.
In Alaska, they have a yearly dividend that they pay people, which could be characterized as a basic income, but it loses kind of a lot of the benefits I was talking about because it only comes once a year, just like you only pay taxes once a year. It's a tiny
If you were
amount.
to spread it
It's-
over a year, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a couple $1,000s for every individual person. So if you're a family of four, that's $8,000 a year. But yeah, it's also the amount is variable. It depends on this Alaska Permanent Fund, oil resource thing.
And also, politicians, like last year, they cut it in half, and so they use the other half to pay for their budget, because there's a budget shortfall of $1.5 billion.
Okay, I did not know that. That's interesting.
And that's one of the reasons why in November, a few weeks beforehand, the Republican governor who approved that dropped out of the election to someone else.
I feel like also, like the fact that it matches the time scale. It's like a nice match of time scale of people's average payments. Most things are done monthly, whether it's like your
Right.
rent, your whatever. It's all coming. Your car insurance, it's all coming monthly. your income is coming in monthly, it makes that the thing. Whereas like having things like come at the end. I mean, you're seeing this with the, with the shutdown, for example. There are like the NSF is shut down right now, which means a lot of like people on fellowships are not getting their paychecks because the government disperses them to the universities in these chunks, and the universities can't then pay their postdocs later, and that's all because it's not guaranteed like a monthly coming like clockwork. I mean that, and it sort of replaces like, and a lot of companies are moving to gig economy anyway. So I feel like just having it monthly is the key.
Yeah.
Is really key.
At least monthly, yeah.
At least monthly, yeah.
And to be fair, there are proposals to expand, like the earned income tax credit, and have that also be paid out more regularly, like once a month or once every couple weeks or something like that. So, the nature of taxes, I mean, like we happen to pay them once a year, but that's not fundamental to how taxes have to work.
Right.
So there's that too.
I sort of feel like also like just sort of at a higher, bigger level, the economy is, becoming so highly optimized, and like in terms of like how rapidly it can turn and how quick jobs can happen, that the sort of legal infrastructure that was developed in the era of like steady long-term employment in decades out doesn't work anyway. So like even like people who are salaried employees, like it like it doesn't really work that well to sort of kind of do everything once a year. I don't know how that factors in the taxes, but
I think that's a really good point. Yeah, and if you look at someone's income pattern, if it's irregular, then if you just shift the period of the taxes they're paying, they could be paying vastly different amounts of taxes over the course of 10 years. Like if someone only earns money, in the summer or something like that, and then the tax period happens to fall, like I don't know, there's depending on the distribution of income over time, you're going to be paying a different amount of tax different years, and there's no way to get it exactly right just by looking at it at a year period, unless everyone's kind of assumed or expected to be making the same amount of money over the course of every month of every year, that kind of thing. Income taxes are tricky. Yeah, Madeline.
I want to get back to another point here.
Yeah.
The inequality in France is not nearly as high as here, and one of the requirements of this Gilets jaunes, yellow jacket movement is that they call it the big have to pay big and the little ones have to pay little, which like the big companies like Google and Apple have to pay a lot of taxes, and the smaller people have to pay less. So for them, inequality, even though it's much less than here, is a big question which they are trying to address.
Yeah.
So how would that be resolved with the UPI?
So it wouldn't, and I would question. So inequality is, if people are suffering, like this is one of the things that they put on their list of complaints. But I would question whether inequality actually is something that's hurting people, or the main thing that's hurting people. I don't think it necessarily matters how rich the rich people are. If you can't eat, then you can't eat. It doesn't matter how rich that rich person is. And if you can eat and you can live a good life, does it matter that the rich person is even richer? Unless the rich people being rich is somehow causing the poor people to be poor, which I think a lot of people would say that there's a connection there. I wouldn't say that.
Perception.
Yeah.
But don't you think that our definition of what it means to say that someone's poor is, our perception of it is kind of relative, right? I mean, I don't think people are actually starving and unable to feed themselves in France for the most part, right? Like we've said, it has the highest level of social benefits.
Many of them are struggling,
You're saying suffering, but I think it's dissatisfaction, and dissatisfaction comes in part from watching on TV,
So-
people flying around in private
So
jets.
in part, but not in whole. If you're living paycheck to paycheck and you're not sure if you can afford to keep your house or like leave your home or something like that, that's not something that is made to be the case because someone else happens to be rich. So certainly, I think there is an element of there's been psychological studies where if people around you are wealthier, then it makes you feel worse about like if they're wealthier than you, that makes you feel worse and that kind of thing. So that's real. But there's also the effect of absolute poverty and people struggling and having the freedom to live their lives the way they want to live them, independent of this other stuff. So I don't know if you guys have followed my blog at all. My most recent blog post was entitled "Inequality is not the problem." So
But
yeah, go ahead, Madeline.
so the people who are in favor of the UBI and
Yeah.
who are looking at this phenomenon of the yellow jackets, they're not necessarily for the UBI because of inequality, but they say that the trend is to look at is to purely look at profit and growth, economic growth, and so part of the goal of this movement, I think, is to really counteract this tendency of our system of economics is to keep growing and keep making profits, and in that sense I think it does take away from the lower classes, not just even only economically, but their quality of life is being affected and that's what they want. They want to sort of create an environment where profit and money is not just the only thing that has value.
Yeah. So I think if the corporate profits in your economy and growth are not aligned with the benefit of consumers, of people, and the improvement of quality of life of
Right.
people, then you have a problem in your economy. And one of the great things about basic income is that you're giving spending power to consumers. So the way to profit becomes more aligned with selling things to consumers that they want that will improve their lives. So one of the things that I'm excited about with basic income is that it actually helps align the profit motive of businesses or of anyone who's trying to make a profit with the benefit of the ordinary people. So in an economy like that, it can actually be okay that businesses are focused on profit because you've aligned the profit incentive with what's good for the people. So that's how I like to think about it.
Because this person is talking about considering work not just sitting in an office and making money, but volunteering or
Sure.
helping your neighbor or
Yeah,
stuff
and
like that is now not considered
I-
profit like useful.
right.
I was just going to say, I mean, I haven't read. I'll read your blog now, but yeah, the inequality thing. I mean, I get the point about you don't if it's not necessarily like if someone's really wealthy, at least if you have the UBI or something, you're fine. But I mean, I agree with that up to a point. But I also think that if you have, money is power to some degree, to a huge degree, money is power. So if there is like large corporations that have a lot of political, they have that translate to political power, and that can then disalign the incentives towards the things that we say we want. So I don't think you can say just that inequality is like, it may not have a direct effect, but it has these indirect effects on how we choose our things, and also kind of feel uncomfortable with the framing of consumers. I think we should be thinking of ourselves as citizens, not just consumers. I mean, I understand that it's good to align things like that in terms of the economy when it works, but there's that should be like a subset of all the concerns, not
Right.
just the only thing.
So I think you're right that inequality of political power is a problem. Political power is something that if you have a lot of it, or if you have most of it, then necessarily everyone else has less of it. It's something that there's kind of a zero sum aspect to political power. Now, the problem is no amount of taking money away from the richest person is going to give more political power to the poorest people. That person is still going to be the richest person unless you take away all their money. But something like a basic income can give political power, can give people the freedom to be more civically engaged, the freedom to think about politics and spend their time more how they choose and be more involved politically.
Yeah.
Taking money away from Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates doesn't automatically do that. It's the giving of money to the people who don't have it that make the biggest difference.
And I completely agree with that, but I think there are like structures and systems that, and it goes beyond individual, like, the individual robber barons of our age, but the structures that systematically prevent changes to the laws and infrastructure that underlie all these things.
Yeah.
And those things, UBI alone doesn't address that.
I think you're right.
That's my point. But I completely agree with giving, because when you give a UBI to people, then you will have the space to have these bigger debates about society, and I completely get that point. But.
Yeah, I think there are important problems that basic income doesn't solve, but certainly it solved an important problem, which is how to get spending money to ordinary people. And I use the word consumer, which I think bothers some people, but really, people are people, and in terms of the economy itself, the role of people is to benefit from what the economy can produce for them, to consume what the economy provides for them. And certainly people have other roles in their lives, et cetera, et cetera. But the reason I use the word consumer so much is because often when we're talking about the economy, we frame citizens as workers rather than consumers. We're asking, well, what do you put in? But really, it's more about what do you get out, and what is the economy capable of providing for you, and how do we make sure that you're getting the most benefit out of the economy. So that's why I focus on the word consumer, and especially as in contrast to the term worker, because the labor market is a market, and if we need you to work, we can pay you to work. That's not your key role in the economy. It's not being a worker. So this quote is related to what we were talking about. Their demands include a redistribution of wealth, as well as an increase of salaries, pensions, social security payments, and the minimum wage. So this is interesting. They're talking about salaries and minimum wage. So they really are framing it as many of us often do, as an entitlement to receive compensation for the labor they contribute, because they feel that the labor they contribute, it doesn't say that right here, but this is implied, that they feel that the labor they contribute is what creates value in the economy. So that's where they get their compensation from. That's what they deserve. That's why they deserve to be paid, because they've contributed their labor, and they're not getting as much money as they need. Therefore, their labor is being underpaid or something like that. And the question that I often bring up is, should it be the role of employers to take care of the employees, or is the role of wages to incentivize people to work? And my feeling is that really it's up to the government to represent the interests of the people, and it's up to the employers to pay people to do the work that they need done. So should people really be fighting for the government to make the employers pay them more, or is it really just simpler to say
Free money.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of why I highlighted this one.
I'm not I open democracy has a list of the demands in English, and one of them is, so I was looking for the sort, because increase of salaries sounds really vague, especially when there's also a minimum wage, and
sure.
And the only salary one that I read it pretty quickly, but if any elected representative will have the right to a median salary, his transport costs will be monitored and reimbursed if they're justified, blah blah. And so I wonder if that's an attempt to sort of get some of that money out of politics, that if you pay elected representatives like a reasonable salary that then regular people can afford to do those jobs, and so you have less of the like, oh, it's only rich people who are like, well, I don't need a real job, I can just be a politician and make laws that affect everyone who's not me.
Oh, I see. So they're demanding that elected officials get higher salaries, so that ordinary people could be incentivized to do that.
Yeah, I mean, that's my impression.
Okay.
This doesn't have like explanations, but I was like, okay, elected representative will have the right to a median salary. That's my intuition about what that's trying.
I think that's a reasonable request. You don't want your elected representatives to just be all, rich people. Then you lose some of the
Which is the system you have right now in the U.S.
How do they
Right.
how do they get paid? I thought there was some sort of like, I'm speaking in America right now, but I thought there was some sort of preset salary for different positions in the United States government.
Yeah, they
Yeah,
do get
okay.
paid some. They just don't get paid all. Like I looked at like what like the city council at Bedford gets paid, and I was like, you can't afford. It's like 20 or 30,000. And I
Yeah,
was
you
like, you
can't
can't
live
live in
on that,
Bedford
really.
on that.
Yeah.
Like you have
Much
to.
less raise a child.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's also the question of how much money do you have to be able to get elected in the first place?
Right. That's
Which is
that's something.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
A
it's
separate
yeah.
issue.
so there's a lot
unaffected by
there's
that,
a lot of this here.
Alex,
Yeah,
I want to
Madeline.
get back to what you just said about the
Yeah.
employer versus the government. So let's say the employer would not contribute to Social Security, which they do right now.
Okay.
That means that the employee would have to pay the 100% of the contribution.
I mean,
I was going to ask the
Big chunk of
same question.
So I'm thinking more generally. Well, I don't like Social Security in the first place, and I don't like the American Social Security system because it's paying people for working, which I'm not a fan of. I think that that should be handled by the market and by wages and by employers and stuff like that.
But don't you contribute yourself to Social Security?
I haven't had a job in a decade.
People, it comes out of your salary. You're actually paying for it.
It's an
I mean,
earned
you
benefit
could-
rather than an entitlement.
Right. It's
I
an
think
it's
is
an
a better
earned
way to describe
it's
it.
an earned benefit. So you are paying into it, and how much you get out does depend on how much you pay in. But it doesn't have to work that way. And ultimately, what makes it possible to disperse Social Security payments to the recipients is that the economy is able to sell them things without causing inflation. So if the economy has the resources to sell goods and services to all the people who are receiving Social Security benefits, then that's what makes it possible to pay the Social Security benefits. It actually doesn't. It's not made possible by the fact that you paid into it. That's just kind of how we structure it, and that's kind of like how we justify it morally and how we justify it in our
Suppose
accounting.
Social Security
Yeah.
would be not mandatory. You know,
Mhm.
you say, no, I don't want to pay social. I just want more money every month.
I think that would be closer to a basic income and closer to something I would prefer.
Right, but that
yeah.
proves that you are actually the one that's paying it
Hmm?
as an employee.
Oh, the employer is paying it.
I'm not sure what you mean. Go ahead, Richard.
Above a certain amount of money you earn, you don't have to pay into Social Security.
No, I know that, but I'm just confused.
Yeah.
That you were saying that okay, so I gave the scenario of the employer not having to contribute to social security,
Yeah.
which you prefer.
So I would say
Because
neither the employee nor the employer would have to contribute. I would say that's the ideal scenario. And the ideal scenario is that you have a basic income that goes to everyone, not just retired people, and that it's based on, well, how much consumer spending can the economy productively respond to, and not how much money was collected via various strange tax mechanisms and stuff like that. Yeah.
I'm glad I have social security.
Me too.
I'm glad you do too. I hope you'll have a basic income soon. So
How does this
Yeah.
tie into other benefits, like health benefits? Because basically, they tell you you got to get a job, or else you're not going to be able to like pay for health insurance for you
Right.
and your family, your children, blah blah blah. I guess that's just another like it's another market that's being like overregulated in my estimation.
I would agree with you. I would say that the healthcare and all the regulations are very complicated, but if you strip that away, it comes down to the same question: like, do we have the resources to provide the medical care? Do we have the
Yeah.
doctors? Do we have the hospitals? You know, all of
My
that
question is
stuff.
more directed towards like how do you what are your thoughts on employers taking care of their employees in this specific regard? Like, what is the alternative?
I mean, like, I wouldn't say that it should be required. I think employers should do whatever they need to do to get the employee to work, right?
Yeah.
So if you're not going to work for them unless they give you health insurance or something like that, then okay, they'll give you health insurance. But if you're going to work anyway, then there's no reason why they should. And I feel like, as with basic income, this is more the government's responsibility. Yeah. Yeah.
The
Not
only
health
reason
insurance.
that an employer
Well, healthcare.
can afford to contribute to healthcare is because they have, they have the power to negotiate much better deals with the insurance companies. That's why
Than the
they do it.
individuals, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, like, then there's an argument to be made for changing the way the health insurance market works,
Yeah, I
single
agree.
payer, that kind of
course,
stuff,
but
right?
Yeah, that would be ideal, but
right.
it's not.
I mean, like, we talk a lot about ideals
Most
here.
other
and-
countries
yeah.
manage to figure it out.
Yeah.
So-
we're not going to be first movers in this.
So we're getting toward the end. I want to go around and get people's final thoughts on the yellow vests or anything we've talked about today. Yeah, Nick.
Yeah, I wish they had been asking for universal basic income instead of lower gas taxes.
Yeah, I think this is it's an interesting phenomenon. I expect it's probably not going to be the last we see of something similar to this happening in other, developed sort of countries. So it's worth watching, and I think, yeah.
Macron claims that he's increasing taxes for the environment. Do you know universal basic income will have an effect for environment in a good way?
My feeling is that it would, partly because of the reduction in traffic. People won't be going to jobs as
Won't be
much
going to
necessarily.
work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I learned a lot from Madeline about this, and
Yeah.
I'm interested in the whole movement, and I agree that it will probably, there'll be more of them. It's like a populist kind of thing that's going on in a lot of countries, including ours.
Trumpism.
I'm afraid to say the
Yeah.
word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Madeline.
Well, it's not Trumpism. I think they are actually a combination of both left and right, and of all the things that they are required, that they demand, which is enormous. If they only get 1% of it, I think it would be a good thing, So I'm sort of sympathetic.
All right.
Not everything that we want, but like I don't need Brexit or all this other nonsense. And I'm basically surprised that it's happening in a country that is not happening here, because we would have much more reason to have such a movement than a country like France.
There's still time.
They don't have the time to organize it, maybe.
We're busy
Yeah.
protesting everything else.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, just kind of piggyback off with you. I think it's interesting, this global wave that's taken over recently. It's interesting. I think they're kind of fighting free market trends in some of the demands that they're making. So good luck with that. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't really agree with it, but just my thoughts.
All right.
I really appreciate hearing from Madeline about a lot of this, because like I said, I didn't really know much about it coming in. I'm kind of impressed, is maybe not the right word, about like the really free-ranging discussion that we had. It was like, oh, we talked a lot about like city planning and stuff, like making a lot of things.
All right.
I didn't really know that much about it. I just had pretty much just read like headlines and things like that over the past like month and a half or something. So
Yeah.
it was really nice to hear from Madeline, who speaks French and can read it and has been following it. So thank you.
All right. Right.
I think it makes me think about what this is going to look like for the United States. Like, what is it going to be? You know, diesel is not expensive here, so it might not be that, but I don't know. Like, who knows? Who knows what it might be? Or maybe we just have this sort of slow burn going on, and it'll just reach this point without us realizing it.
You're like the toads or frogs in a
Yes.
Boiling water,
Indeed, yes.
turn temperature up.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I don't understand populism as well as I probably should going forward. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So Bethany says, one thing we didn't talk about as much is that certain issues like reducing carbon emissions are a public goods problem, which means it can be very challenging to get individuals on board. Also, I think we raised the issue of to what extent do we weight the needs of special interests at the cost of the rest? Rural dwellers potentially being one example of a special interest. And also agreed, thanks to everyone, and especially Madeline for sharing her expertise. Yeah, so I think this was a great discussion, and thank you, Madeline, and thank you, everyone. There was great participation tonight. And I think, these types of populist movements are kind of an ongoing thing. And it'll be interesting to see if basic income becomes more and more part of the narrative.
Yeah.
I hope it does. There have certainly been populist movements in the past where, the movement kind of reaches its full conclusion. And yeah, and the outcomes are not the best for people sometimes. So I hope it goes better this time. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Alex. Thank
Next
you.
week we're talking about the subsidy reform plan in Iran, which was something they did in the early 2010s with their oil subsidies, and they kind of shifted it into something that looked more like a basic income. And a lot of basic income advocates kind of compare that plan with a basic income, and it's not going on anymore. It kind of phased out in 2016, but we'll be talking about it next week.
Keeping the international focus.
Keeping the
Yeah,
international
yeah.
focus.
Yeah.
All right.
Venezuela and
Yep.
Yellow Vest.
You'll need to bring in someone who reads Arabic